Well, welcome everyone. Hello. We're glad to have you join us on our third ISQOLS webinar. This is part of a new series that we're running, and we are certainly excited to have everyone join us for this one. This is how an activist researcher became a cartoon character, HyperCapitalism Values and Quality of Life. Just a few introductions. Tim, and it's Kasser. He is our special guest speaker, PhD professor and chair of psychology at Knox College in Illinois, an activist, author, and researcher. And Laura will give a little bit more details about him in a moment. Laura Musikanski, of course, is the executive director of Happiness Alliance at happycounts.org. Definitely check out that website when you can. And myself, my name is Jill Johnson, and I'm the executive director for ISQOLS. With that, I will turn it over to Laura to do a little bit of more introductions and information about him.
Thank you, Jill. I'm so excited to be part of this webinar presenting Tim Kasser's work because Tim really has changed my life and changed the way I talk about the work that I do in the happiness movement. The work that Tim did, and I think that this is best encapsulated in one of his articles, Meeting Environmental Challenge, the Role of Human Identity. That work that he's done in really connecting the values and the indicators that we use, I think has been so instrumental in conveying this message, particularly to youth, for me when I go and give talks at schools. I also really appreciate that Tim is a wide thinker and that he really does connect the dots and make connections on so many different levels. And I'm really excited that he is doing this comic book. I think it's just a fantastic approach. I'm also very appreciative, and I'm sure that you are too, of his YouTube vid that went viral that was about his book, The High Price of Materialism, which I'm sure he'll talk about. We were contemplating whether he would give a talk about his latest publication, which is called Living Both Well and Sustainably, a review of the literature with some reflections on future research interventions and policy, but decided to go ahead and go with the comic book. So here we go, and again, thank you so much.
It's a real pleasure to be here today. I want to thank everyone for inviting me, and let's go ahead and get started. So I've been doing research on values and quality of life for a long, long time. And after my first book, The High Price of Materialism, was published in 2002, I started getting invited to lots of non-academic kinds of settings in order to give talks. And here's just sort of some images from some of the places where I've spoken over the years. You know, it's everything from a high school for girls to a United Kingdom, actually governmental department, from financial planners to an organization like organizations like Oxfam and WWF. And so one of the things that I increasingly encountered was trying to understand how it is that I could share with people from lots and lots of different backgrounds my understanding of values and how values are related to quality of life, as well as the important role that culture plays in all of this. So I was increasingly interested in this sort of problem of communication, if you will, and learned a lot in my early days, especially about how not to talk to other people who weren't academics about academic kinds of topics. But one of the things throughout I really wanted to make sure happened was that, and I think this was part of the problem that I encountered at first, was I needed to be a scientist first. I had to retain my integrity as a scientist, and I had to make sure that what it was that I was saying was still based in the science. At the same time, though, I needed to help people who weren't always scientists, most who weren't scientists, try to see what I was saying and try to see that it had some empirical support behind it. So I struggled with this issue for a number of years, but kept trying to work away at it. And then in 2011, I had a really interesting opportunity. I was on the board of an activist organization, a not-for-profit, that's called Center for a New American Dream. And Center for a New American Dream invited me to make one of those videos where I narrate it and then the person draws along while I'm narrating. And so I wrote that. I wrote up the script and I narrated it. and the guy drew it, and much to our surprise, it did far better than we ever expected. Within I think 2 months, it was up around 300,000 views, and now 6 years later, almost, it's over 750,000 views. And, this experience really showed to me, how if you turn something into a really different kind of modality, you could reach a whole lot of people. I mean, there's no way that my scholarly work has been read or looked at by 750,000 people. But here, this different kind of modality allowed other individuals into the science and into the conversation about materialism, about values, about quality of life. And so what I did at that point resulted in my next book. So even before I made this New American Dream video, I had this idea for a book rolling around in my head. I started writing it actually in 2007. It wasn't working. I quit. I started it again around 2011. It wasn't working. I quit. And then after the success of this YouTube video, I thought, well, maybe this book that I have in my head should be a cartoon book, okay? Because I watched the ways that my kids just devoured cartoons, and I knew from lots of other kinds of videos like this, like the Story of Stuff video, that cartoons were really a great way to communicate sometimes complicated information. And so I ended up reaching out to a guy named Larry Banach, who's a very interesting cartoonist. He was actually a graduate student in mathematics at Harvard University in the 60s and 70s, and he dropped out to become a cartoonist. And he spent the whole rest of his career as a cartoonist. He's in his 70s now. Probably his most famous book is the one on the far there, The Cartoon History of the Universe. That's just the first of 5 books, actually. It starts with the Big Bang, and it goes all the way till the 1980s. But Larry has also written books about cartoon guides to statistics, to calculus, to algebra, to chemistry, to physics, to the environment, to sex, to computers, whole shebang. So the thing I admired about Larry's books was how he was able to take really complicated ideas, present them in a visual format, and also oftentimes in a pretty funny format. And so I wrote him, I just sent him an email and I said, hey, I have this idea for a book. Would you be interested in doing it? So that's about 4 years ago. And this January, the book is going to be coming out. So it's a book about hypercapitalism, the modern economy, its values, and how to change them. And it's told entirely in graphical format with yours truly as the cartoon narrator. And so what I want to do next is to show you some of the things that we did in the book. I mean, it's a 250-page cartoon book, and so there's a lot of things in there that are based in history or in politics or in economics, etc. What I want to focus on today is the presentation of data, okay, and the presentation of psychological and quality of life ideas, because that really forms a big core of the book. One of our fundamental arguments is that what happens under hypercapitalism is that it lowers quality of life. It decreases our own personal well-being, it diminishes social well-being, and it definitely harms the planet's well-being and the species, other species' well-being, and probably the well-being of future generations. And so the whole idea of well-being and quality of life is actually core to the book. And indeed, after the preface, the very first image and text which the reader receives is Thomas Jefferson sitting here at his desk trying to figure out how to complete life, liberty, and what, right? Okay. And, it's interesting to note that before he wrote Life, Liberty, and Happiness, or The Pursuit of Happiness, other colonists who were rebelling had been saying life, liberty, and property. And so it was actually a decision on his part to focus on happiness. And very soon afterwards, we introduced a term that I'm sure pretty much anybody who's on this webinar is familiar with, the idea of eudaimonia, which comes from ancient Greece and from Aristotle in particular. And so literally page 2, the reader is learning a pretty complicated the quality of life concept and breaking it down here with Jefferson explaining it. We then go on to present how eudaimonia and these ideas have presented themselves in other kinds of philosophers. So here you see Aristotle and Epicurus talking about how it is that a focus on money, focus on materialistic values ends up diminishing people's quality of life, which is what pretty much my career has been investigating. We also talk about the Buddha and Jesus, all in cartoon format as well. So this idea of happiness, starts to come across here right away at the very front of the book. Now, the next kind of psychological thing we turn to pretty quickly is the idea of values. So the fundamental thing that I've been researching for a long time is how different kinds of values are associated with different kinds of quality of life. And so we have to introduce the idea of values. And if you know anything about values research, the primary mover and shaker in that is a man named Shalom Schwartz, who's identified that there's about 10 to 12 different basic values that that people across the globe seem to focus on at one level or another. So here, these are three of the boxes that are introducing some of the values. And the thing that I really love about this way of doing things here is, I know I've been a professor for a long time, and I've come to see that a lot of my students don't think as well verbally as they do think visually, right? And so part of what's going on here is that what Larry has done has been to sort of marry these kind of high-level abstract concepts about what self-direction values are with a very concrete image, right? The same for universalism. And I think what that does is it will help anybody to better understand the idea behind that value, but also, for those who maybe have trouble at a more verbal level, especially younger people, it will help them to get a sense of what self-direction really means. Now, the fundamental premise of the book is that when people and cultures focus their lives around money and image and status, those values stand in fundamental conflict with values that promote quality of life. And there's a great deal of research in the psychological literature which supports that idea. Which I'll be showing you some of in a little bit here. But we also needed early on to identify or to introduce the idea of value conflict. And so here we aren't talking about materialism per se. We're just getting across this idea that values are in conflict, that it's hard to be somebody who cares completely about freedom and also listen to authority, right? Because authority usually stops our freedom. So the guy who wants authority is going to conflict with the person with freedom. The guy who wants stability is going to conflict with the woman who wants thrills. And I think, again, the way that things are drawn here really is evocative of that, okay? The evocative that they're bumping into each other and they can't kind of keep moving. There's going to be conflict. Another way that we represent it here is with a seesaw. This is a metaphor that I've used in my own talks for a long time, because what we know from the research is that as you focus on these extrinsic materialistic values more, the intrinsic values tend to go down. And vice versa, though. As you focus on intrinsic values, the extrinsic values tend to go down. So here again is, that's the cartoon me, by the way. Using this visual way to represent value conflict and trying to find a balance between those. So let's move on to kind of the presentation and more of data and findings, okay? So in a lot of ways, the value stuff is all based on data. It's all based on results or statistical results. But here we're starting to present actual, real down and dirty kind of research findings here. So some of you might be familiar with the UCLA's study of college freshmen. Every year since the late 1960s, they ask about 100,000 college freshmen what's important to them. Okay, and they've been doing that year after year after year. And so here we're presenting those data basically. Okay, and fundamentally it's just a graph. Okay, but the way that it's laid out makes it, I think, far more appealing than the standard graph we're going to see in a scientific journal, okay? And I love the way Larry drew me sort of being surprised, right? Oh my gosh, look at this big increase, okay? As a way to sort of bring home this idea that the percentage of people who think it's very well important to be very well off financially has basically doubled in this period. So there's sort of some time series results. Here's some correlational results. So this comes from a study I published in 2011, and it was done at the nation level. So the subjects here are nations, if you will. And what the correlation is between the values of the nation. Are they more hierarchical, focused on status and money and power, or are they more egalitarian, focused on equality and social justice? So there's a way we can measure that in nations. And then this axis represents the number of minutes or hours of ads per day that are being aimed at children. Okay, and so essentially what we've done here is to present a scatter plot with a best fitting line so that you can see that the US is hierarchical and a lot of hours, and Norway and Belgium are egalitarian and few hours. And if you still don't get it, then the very next cartoon image kind of talks about both ends of the correlation. So over here we have the discussion that the more egalitarian societies shelter their kids from commercial manipulation. So there's a bunch of kids out there playing, all right? These, by the way, these are our characters who represent hypercapitalism. This is Cappy Freemark, the investor, and Algae, the multinational for-profit corporation. So they're characters that recur throughout the book. Over here, you have the other end of the correlation. Some American kids sitting in front of a big screen TV looking at Tony the Tiger, telling Algae to be quiet because they want to watch the cartoon, right? Okay. So it's sort of like the discussion section of a results, only told in cartoon format. We also present experimental results too. So in this set of slides, I'm going to show you about some studies Kathleen Vos did. So I've been talking about this idea that, so think back to the seesaw image, that if you get people focused on extrinsic values, as those go up, the intrinsic focus goes down. Now, most of that work has been done at a correlational level, but what some studies have done have been to use social cognitive methods in order to activate those in people's minds. So what I love about this drawing is here you got the experimenter's hand pushing the idea of money into the subject's head, okay? And that's representing this idea of being primed. And then what we do, and we present some results here, you know, so in this study, people have either been primed to think about money or to think about a neutral object like cats, for example, and then they're asked to donate some of their $2 honorarium to a charity. So here this woman with money only donates 77 cents. Here, this woman with a neutral topic on her mind donates $1.34. But what I really want you to also look at is how Larry Drew thinks. Look at her eyebrows there, okay? And look at her fist, right? She's like all kind of tensed up and mad, you know? Whereas this person almost seems content, who's giving a fair bit of money to the charity because she's not sitting there thinking about money. So again, this way in which the visual helps to reinforce the basic idea behind the study. Now, in the last half of the book, what we do is we talk about solutions. So we talk about all kinds of different solutions. We present a variety of other kinds of data as to why those solutions might be good. I'm just going to focus here on one that, again, ISQOLS people are probably familiar with, which is having different indicators of progress. Okay, so right now, there's all the focus on GNP, GDP, etc. So here's Cappy Freemark again. GDP is up, life is good. So he thinks life is good because it's all about economic growth. But then what we try to do is to say how the problem with this is that when you focus on intrinsic values for helping other people, oftentimes because of the way values are organized, that ends up conflicting with money values. And we kind of lay that idea out here. So this is another recurring character, Ernie Wages. He's our worker. And in this case, Ernie's mom is dying, and he has two choices. He can work less and take care of his mom, okay, which will actually depress GNP, okay, because he's not earning as much and he's not paying a nursing home. Or he can go out and work more so that he can pay somebody else to take care of his mom, in which case he ends up not having a very good relationship with his mom, okay? So the focus on the extrinsic values on GDP ends up suppressing the intrinsic values. And I just love the line, Ernie, you heartless cog, okay? You know, that's totally Larry's line. He's a really funny guy. And then, you know, very soon afterwards, we end up introducing the idea of gross national happiness. So here's Bhutan, me getting to visit Bhutan finally, and learning about the indicators of progress and the different variables that they use in Bhutan to measure progress. So in summary, what I want to just say is, you know, I hope what this shows is that you can talk about science in a way other than just in the standard journal article, you know, that there are ways to go out and reach out to individuals, you know, who I think are interested in the ideas to still have an integrity with the science. I think the results that are presented here are basic to what the findings were, but we're just talking about them in a fundamentally different way than we normally would in a journal article, than we normally would in an academic talk, etc. And in doing so, hopefully both making them more accessible so that more people can hear those ideas, and cementing them in by the mix of the visual image with the words. So that's all I have to say. So I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. So should I stop share now, Laura? Or no, we were going to have me keep share, weren't we? In case I wanted to switch to it.
Moderate questions.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So, what questions do you have?
And participants, for those of you who came in late, you can either use the chat button, or you are welcome to unmute yourself and simply just ask your question. Lorraine says, love these ideas. Jorge, you have a question? Go ahead, and you can either unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. I have a question. Well, it's more or less myself, I'm in an organization that is called Economics Without Borders, and we are with the social justice and those kind of things. So we talk very much about hypermaterialism or hypercapitalism, and how to and we organize chats and we organize seminars, but all the time the same people come. So we have this feeling like we are educating the people that are already educated. And in the same way, 2 years ago, I have a course in ecological economics. Well, it was environmental economics, but I taught ecological economics, which has many things to do with what you are talking, in the Faculty of Economics. So it was people who had very materialistic values, as you have studied. And I have one of the worst teaching experiences, that because I was telling things that I consider that were true and has empirical basis, but they didn't want to listen. It's like they were focused on, I want to just tell me what is going instead of the exam, and shut up because I want to go working in a bank, you know, to make practices. So my question is, I think this really can help to reach people, but in my position, which tools do you consider that we can apply to reach more people that don't want, or they are not ready to listen to this? Because sometimes it's frustrating, like you're working very hard organizing things, and you have a good message, and always people that already know about this, or people that finally you reach them and they don't want just to know anything. It's just shut up.
Sure.
I'm not interested.
Yeah. Well, I personally think that there are three. You talked about two groups of people. I think there are three groups of people. You know, I think that the first group of people are the people who are already on board with the idea. Okay. So I don't know if you have this saying in Spain, but in America we call that preaching to the choir. Right? So if the choir is already there in church and you're preaching to them, well, they're already there in church, right? So they're probably going to listen to you. So that's the first group of people, and I think that's who you were talking about, that's in your organization, right? You know, the second group of people are the people who are your opponents and whose minds are made up and who, to be honest, I think it's not worth investing a whole lot of time in trying to talk to. You know, I think that that's a real struggle, because I think that the third group of people is actually the largest group, at least for the kinds of things I'm talking about and I think that you're talking about. And those are people who actually haven't given it all that much thought, okay, who really haven't kind of wondered about these issues a whole lot, who are still young and forming their impressions, and who are sort of open either way, you know. And so my view is that part of what we need to be doing around these kinds of issues when we're critiquing capitalism and materialism and such is not so much worrying about how are we going to change the minds of people who think the opposite of us, but how are we going to reach out and talk to the people who aren't with us but aren't against us. And that's where I really have found over the last 10 years in particular, I've been trying to focus my energy. And to me, that's who this book is written for, actually, okay? You know, I hope that there'll be a lot of people who are on my side who read this book and think it's funny and useful and maybe get some new ideas. But really, to me, it's about trying to reach people who maybe are interested but haven't really thought through the issues very much and give them a way that they can understand things. So that would be really my response to you, is to identify that third group of folks and put your energy there.
Thank you.
You bet.
It looks like we have a question from Lorraine. And Lorraine, I'll go ahead and read this on your behalf. It says, given some of the value similarities between the US and China that Schwartz talks about, how much do you think capitalism is the issue versus weak culture importance given to egalitarian and universalism values?
Well, so the fundamental idea of what I've been writing since 2007. So in 2007, I wrote a book called American Corporate Capitalism, and it was really my first kind of head-on where I really sort of named capitalism, if you will. And the fundamental point of that article, which is really the fundamental point of this book, is that every economic system, indeed every social system, requires certain values to be privileged in order to maintain itself. So for example, in order for Christianity as a social system, for Christianity to maintain itself, it needs people to believe there's one God, it needs people to believe in the 10 Commandments, etc. It socializes people into a set of beliefs. Similarly, for hunter-gathering to work thousands and thousands of years ago, people had to be socialized into this belief that, you know, you found stuff and you shared it with your kin group, okay? And that was a value. Capitalism has, just like all those other social systems, also has a particular set of values that it needs people to prioritize. And this is basically what chapters 2, 3, and 4 about are in the book, and this is what that 2007 paper is that capitalism requires people to focus on money, status, image, etc., because that's what keeps people working hard, that's what makes people consume a lot, that's what makes people vote for politicians, at least in the case of America, for you know, politicians who promise us higher economic growth, etc., etc., etc. Now, the problem is that the way that the human value system is organized is that as a social system puts increasing emphasis on those extrinsic goals, because of the way the value system is organized, those intrinsic values are going to go down, okay? And there's research that shows this experimentally, and there's also research that shows it cross-nationally. And so the answer then is that from my view, what capitalism has done in America and continues to do, and what it's doing in China, is by privileging the extrinsic materialistic values that are necessary in order for capitalism to work, it ends up undermining and suppressing the egalitarian values. It weakens them, okay? But and that's a consequence of an increasing focus on those extrinsic materialistic values. That's the fundamental argument, and it's fairly well supported by data. So I agree that weak egalitarian values is the problem, but I see that as fundamental to the dynamics inherent in capitalism. That's the end of my answer.
Thank you. Lorraine says thank you. Are there any other questions? I guess I have a final question for you, Tim. You said the book will be available in January.
That's right.
And is it on Amazon, or how can everyone purchase that?
Sure. Well, it is on Amazon, believe it or not.
Ironically.
Yeah, there were a couple points where I thought about making a crack about Amazon at some point. So, but you can also. So one of the decisions that we made early on has to do with the publisher. So the publisher of the book is a publisher that's called the New Press, and the New Press is actually it's a trade press, but it's not for profit. It's actually a not-for-profit trade press. So it's not a university press, which are usually not-for-profit too. But it actually is a 501c3 organization. For those of you, who maybe don't know American tax law, that means you can make a donation to it. Okay, you can donate to the New Press, and all of the profits that they make from books, hopefully they'll make a profit from ours, actually don't go to shareholders, don't go to the owner. They get fed right back into the New Press's coffers in order to put out more books that are interested in social justice and environmental sustainability and all of the rest. And so that was actually the only place we submitted a proposal to, was the New Press, because we really wanted to be able to practice what we preach with regard to the publication of this book. So you can go to the New Press, and I think you can buy it direct from them too.
Okay. And given your success with YouTube, have you considered creating a promotional video, an animated promotional video?
We've considered it, but never actually talked about it in detail. Yes, I would say.
Okay.
So I do think it is the kind of book that, at some level, there are features of it that would lend itself well to videos. Certain parts of it, because again, there are kind of these recurring characters that you meet throughout the book, etc. And there are, I think, some pretty funny things. So yeah, I think it could be a video one day. Well, I'm waiting to see. We'll wait and see what happens with that.
I'm sure that takes a lot of work.
It would be a lot of work. I think it would be a lot of work.
Great. Any other questions? I think we have time for one more. Anyone has any? Laura?
Oh, I just wanted to, we've got one more question, I think. And then I want to just let people know about December 8th. So.
Okay. Jorge, did you want to ask this yourself?
Yes, sorry. I'm enthusiastic. I like it very much, so I'm taking too much time maybe. I wanted to ask you, do you consider that these empirical results, we can build some bridge on non-violence or peace studies, or in particular Gandhian philosophy? Do you know if there is some literature that has link, or I don't know, or you take this into account in the book?
We certainly do talk about, I don't think Gandhi is mentioned. We definitely talk about war at certain points, and about how materialism supports ideas that can oftentimes lead to mistreating other people and to war. So there's a lot in there about social justice and equality. For sure, there's that. I would say not so much about peace studies, but I would say there's no doubt that that's a possibility. So again, when we go back to Schwartz's model of values in particular, the universalism values, so here I've just talked about they are helping and supporting all people and nature, but actually peace is one of the universalism values that Schwartz assesses. And the universalism values stand in opposition to the self-enhancement values of money, status, power. So I would say it's not a big jump to suggest that that issues of peace are related to universalism values, and therefore likely to be problematic the more that people focus on materialistic values. So the connection lies dormant. It's there waiting to be pulled out, more than it was certainly pulled out in this book. If you're interested, though, I'd encourage you to visit a website that's called valuesandframes.org. And there you'll see some of the work that I did with Tom Crompton of the World Wildlife Fund, where we developed an idea called common cause, where the point of common cause is to say, hey, look, you know, whether you're an environmental organization or a disability organization or a social development organization or a peace organization, you all rely on the same values in people in order to be able to meet your goals. And all of those values are suppressed to the extent people focus on extrinsic values. We're trying to bring together across various across various mission statements almost, organizations that share the same fundamental underlying values from the Schwartz and our circumplex models. So you might look there. Tom may have written some things about peace, but there's a lot of stuff about that basic idea. Valuesandframes.org.
Thank you.
You bet.
So I hope you can hear me. Thank you so much, Tim. Really honored to include you. Thank you to people who joined, and we will be having our next webinar on the 8th of December with Björn Grind, who will talk about the brain, quality of life, and intentional communities. We'll be having more webinars in 2018. Our intent is to bring new ideas, cutting edge solutions. Thank you, Tim, for exemplifying that. And if you would like to be in a webinar, to be featured in a webinar, or know somebody who you think would be good, please let Jill and myself know. We've recorded this and we will put this up on YouTube, as are all of the other and will be, hopefully, future videos. So have a lovely day, and thank you to everybody.
Thank you, Tim, so much. This was
welcome.
Fantastic. Thank you.
I'm glad you liked it. Yeah, thank you everybody for joining. I appreciate it. And if anybody wants, you know, any of the research literature behind some of the things I said today, feel free to drop me an email. I'm easily found on the internet, and I'll be happy to send you some non-cartoon science articles.